Welcome to our latest roundtable. It's hard to believe another school year is just about over. My name is Ann Vasquez, the CEO of EdSource. California is home to many children who enter school speaking languages other than English. How those children learn to read English while navigating dual languages requires special consideration. EdSource has spent more than a year documenting the struggles and possible solutions to California's reading crisis. Today, we'll dive deeper into what the research says about teaching reading to children learning in a second language. Alarmed by the number of children who don't yet read at grade level by third grade, many are advocating for a more structured literacy curriculum, often referred to as the science of reading. But how does that approach work for multilingual learners, and how can we make sure the needs of English learners are not overlooked? Lastly, EdSource would not be able to bring us all together for our monthly roundtables if it weren't for the support of our funders. A big thank you to the Sobrato Philanthropies for making today's roundtable possible. Now for our introductions. First, I would like to welcome to our panel Ka Vang, principal in the Winton School District at Frank Sparks Elementary, which has been recognized as having a large number of English learners who read and write at grade level by third grade. Please also welcome Sonia Aguila, who was named the 2023 National Bilingual Teacher of the Year by the National Association of Bilingual Education. She is currently a second grade teacher in the dual immersion program at Canalino Elementary School in the Carpinteria Unified School District. Next, I'd like to introduce Pedro Figueroa, a bilingual kindergarten teacher at Potrero Elementary School in the Mountain Empire Unified District in rural San Diego County. I'd also like to give a special welcome to Becky Sullivan, Director of K-12 English Language Arts at the Sacramento Office of Education. And last but not least, please welcome Marta Martinez, Senior Director of Research and Evaluation for Sobrato Early Academic Language, SEAL, a nonprofit dedicated to improving the education of dual language learners and English learners. Special thanks to our moderator today, EdSource reporter Zadie Stavely, as well as those who are working behind the scenes who are helping answer the questions as they come up today. Welcome to everyone in the audience. Zadie, why don't you take it from here?
Hi, everyone. I think we should start with a question that kind of overarches the entire conversation, which is what reading skills do English learners need to be taught? And how is it different teaching reading for English language learners, children who are learning English as a second or third language, and teaching students whose first language is English? And, how are their needs different? And basically, what does the research say about that? We could start with Marta.
So first of all, thank you for having me here. And I just want to say that English reading instruction for ELs needs to simultaneously develop their English language proficiency as well as their English literacy skills. And what we know from research, and specifically the work of the Federal Reading for Understanding Initiative, is that knowledge, language, and reading comprehension are deeply connected, and that the act of reading is a situated cultural activity. So in order for ELs to benefit from English literacy instruction, they need explicit ELD instruction. They need many opportunities for oral language practice, and they also need deeper and different meaning-making instruction. From research, we also know that where most ELs tend to struggle is not related to phonological awareness or decoding, but in reading comprehension, language comprehension, and in vocabulary. And this is not to imply that ELs do not need instruction in phonological awareness and decoding, but rather that there is a danger in overemphasizing these foundational skills in instruction and underemphasizing the language comprehension part of the reading comprehension equation. So what exactly do ELs need? Well, for English-only classrooms, I would refer the audience to the Council for Great City Schools framework for foundational literacy instruction for ELs, which really does a solid job of incorporating the EL research base related to English literacy skills for ELs in English medium classrooms. And it highlights the importance of leveraging the home language and EL's linguistic repertoires in general, grounding foundational skills instruction in grade level content, prioritizing meaning making and comprehension, simultaneously developing code-based literacy skills and language comprehension skills, and assessing reading comprehension based on a student's ability to read with proper expression and to convey meaning, not just on their reading fluency. This also applies to bilingual classrooms. However, in addition to these aforementioned considerations, Within bilingual contexts, it's important to teach metalinguistic awareness to help students identify cross-language differences and similarities. And it's important not to waste precious instructional time teaching foundational skills that transfer between the two languages. However, it's very important to explicitly teach language irregularities within and across both languages.
Sorry, Martha, can we let Becky jump in as well? Just because Becky is also part of the early literacy support block grant, and I'd like to hear her perspective as well.
Okay, so what Martha said, and then I'll just keep going so she got cut off. Just kidding. So the process of learning how to read is the same when you're learning in your primary language. And there's been some studies done of Spanish, English, Hebrew, and Chinese, where they took brain imaging of children who are learning how to read. And it turns out that the imaging in the brains is similar, even though some of those are non-alphabetic languages. So what's happening in the brain is similar across those languages as kids learn how to read. And we also know from a lot of the research that methodologies are similar in a successful delivery of teaching students how to read. So as Martha was telling us, we cannot teach word recognition or language comprehension at the expense of the other. Both must fully be attended to produce a skilled, proficient reader. And when you're learning to read in an additional language, the teachers need to know what skills the students are coming to the table with so that they can capitalize on those skills that can transfer over to the new language. And when you are learning to read in an additional language, you really have to have explicit instruction in the sounds that are different from your first language. You also have to have careful instruction in the syntax and spoken grammar of English, if that's the target language, academic and general vocabulary, continual exposure to rich content and conversation from the very, very start of school. And of course, we have to have more intentional work in oral language development, vocabulary, and text comprehension.
Okay. I knew we were going to talk about oral language development, and both of you mentioned that. And so I want to know, what is oral language development and what does it look like? And I'd like to hear from Ka first, kind of what does that look like at Frank Sparks?
Thank you so much. So I think in my opinion, good language development is letting students play with words. That's what we do here. When I say letting students play with words, it's basically, by practicing saying the words, illustrating what the word means, also practicing the words in various contexts, and like I said, and having the students practice those words with their peers. And what I mean by having kids experience vocabulary words, I'll give you an example. For instance, like the word play, especially like a kindergarten student that's a newcomer. So the teacher would say, "Hey, this is the word play," and they would take them to go as that. We go to play on the playground. We go to play on Duck Duck Goose. To play Duck Duck Goose. I think the language experience really helps students kind of connect the word play with when I go outside or when I play with other kids. Playing means that I'm going to be interacting with other kids in activities. So playing with, doing activities with other kids. Mainly that's what we do here. It seems to be effective. But like I said, I'm not an expert on teaching oral language development. But I just believe in just having the kids play with words and experiencing the words.
Sonia or Pedro, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So 25 years ago, when I started teaching, we wanted quiet classrooms. Everybody be quiet, work. Education has changed, and it should. So now we encourage kids to talk, to share, discuss. And we do a lot of things in the classroom, such as turn and talk to your partner, heads together if they're in small groups. I also like to do, at our school, we do what is called a 10-2. So for every 10 minutes that the teacher is talking, we give students 2 minutes to discuss and absorb. I also like to use whole brain teaching, where we do mirror, and they repeat what the teacher is saying. So again, we want students to be engaged, no more quiet classrooms. It's also important to create a safe environment, so students know that it's okay to make mistakes. They're all from different levels, and so, proficiency levels, and the classroom should be a safe place to participate and make mistakes and learn from mistakes.
One of the things that I always did in my classroom and do is we learn lots of songs. I make it a goal to learn 30 songs a year. So, I teach kinder, so head, shoulders, knees, and toes, nursery rhymes. I think nursery rhymes are important because they have a cultural component that kids who are English learners, I think, need to learn, because in the future, when they're reading text at higher levels or when they're discussing things at higher levels, we have all kinds of references in the English language to nursery rhymes. And it's important for them to know that so that they can make that connection when they're reading text at higher levels. So warming up ELD with 1, 2, buckle my shoe, 3, 4, and doing the hand signals. So 5, 6, pick up stick, 7, 8, lay them straight, 9, 10, do it over again. And then, of course, head, shoulder, knees, and toes. And any rhymes that you're using, try to use a total physical response so that they're using their bodies to identify body parts, or to imagine what it is that they're doing when they sing this song. Of course, if they know the words in English but don't know what they mean, well, it's important to explain what they mean as well, and to give context to what it is that they're singing.
So one of the ways that one of the questions that came from our audience actually earlier was, how can teachers leverage the literacy skills that students already have in their home language? Now, many students start school without knowing how to read in either language, right? But they may already have some skills in their home language, or, maybe they came later on and they already do speak, they already do read in another language. So, how can teachers kind of build on those literacy skills that they may already have?
In my classroom, we create opportunities for them to engage in conversations, and they use their full repertoire. I teach in a dual language classroom, and 70% of the day is in Spanish, 30% in English. And at the beginning of our program, we would say, we speak Spanish until 1, and then after 1, we speak English. And, we, we don't do that anymore. We allow them to use, whatever language comes first. We also give them choices to demonstrate mastery. It doesn't have to be, one specific way to show what they know. There's so many ways they can show you. And again, in my classroom, my situation, it's 2 languages.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that because our language and our model, I teach Spanish and my co-teacher teaches in English, but for bridging, for the purposes of bridging, I do teach math in English, but we count in English, then we count in Spanish. And, I teach the concept in English, we do the concept in English, but you always get these looks from the kids. They don't understand what's going on. So I bridge. I give them the concept in Spanish, and then we repeat the concept in Spanish and then repeat it in English. So there's a lot of back and forth between the language. So there's comprehension. So it's comprehensible input, but also because they need to know the vocabulary in both languages.
I'll jump in here. I think you have to find out what skills the kids actually have before you can capitalize on them. So whether it be through formative assessment or a formal assessment, you need to figure that part out. And then once you know the literacy skills of your students, you can capitalize on things like cognates. You can capitalize on sounds that are similar, language patterns. And then you need to have a plan for filling in the gap, if you will. So what is the scope and sequence that you're going to follow? Take a look at the ELD standards in whether it be oral language development in part 1 or the structure of the English language in part 2 of the standards. Especially because if your target language that they're learning is English, it has a very deep orthography. So there will be, if you're going from Spanish to English and you have Spanish literacy, there will be sounds that transfer. But for instance, there are 5 vowel sounds in Spanish and 20 something in English. So you have to have a plan for teaching those because those are not going to transfer over. So those are just some considerations.
Martha?
I was going to say, I mean, the leveraging of the home language is also different depending on whether it's a bilingual classroom or an English only one. And so we have a lot of folks here who have the bilingual classroom expertise, which is awesome. I guess I just want to emphasize that even in English only classrooms, you can leverage the home language. And part of that depends on how well you know the students' other languages. But also even when you don't, you can learn some basics about that language, and you can always encourage the family to continue using the home language at home because it's really important, again, to continue fostering just language development.
Yeah, a lot of parents will say, well, I can't read an English teacher. How am I going to help them? And I always encourage them, read to them in their own language, have discussions about the text so that, there's so much we know that when kids aren't having those dialogues about text and about whatever general topic there is, and they don't have the vocabulary in their first language, it's harder to learn it in the second language. So I always encourage parents to read at home, even though it's not in English. Why? Because those literacy skills would transfer, the ability to think about stories, the ability to listen, to listen to pausing, to all the things that we know are important to literacy. And I always tell parents, think of 2 or 3 questions that are open-ended so that the kids can talk about what they're learning. And unfortunately, a lot of kids go home and they don't talk. They don't talk with their parents. They don't talk to each other. They're placed in front of a TV or something like that. And so that language is not developing the way it needs to. So that's a very important skill. Going along with assessments, that's so important. I know when my kids come to me and I'm assessing them for phonemic awareness, a lot of times because they're getting phonemic awareness from their English teacher, they come and they don't hear that last sound. Even though Spanish is their native language for a lot of them, they don't remember the last sound in, say, casa. They don't hear the A because they've been listening to phonemic awareness in English, and they hear cat, and they stop after the 3rd sound. So it's important for teachers to continue to use phonemic awareness if they can in the primary language. And of course, with phonics, really very clearly explaining the difference between G and J with Spanish, because the kids confuse G and J and they confuse H because those sounds are different, whereas most of the consonants in Spanish and English are the same. For instance, the F, the P, the M. So those are important as well.
All of you have had experience, observing classrooms or being in classrooms. And so, one of my big questions is what do you think is missing from many teachers' reading instruction especially for English learners?
5 more hours to the day, perhaps. Time is always the enemy. But
I've noticed a lot of teachers teaching whole class and not differentiating. It's easier to teach whole class. Not ideal, though. Also, multicultural libraries. I'm working on mine. We want to have books in the classroom. The students need to see authors that look like them, that speak like them. Artifacts, realia, we need to bring all that to the classroom. And sometimes, you just rush and teach the lesson and don't have the time to prepare bring things to the classroom. And now with technology, it's so easy. I carry my iPad all the time. And like today, a student didn't know what a fig tree was. And so I said, oh, let me show you a minute. And now I know. So things like that I've noticed. And I try to teach those things when I have student teachers that are starting the profession.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things that I use a lot is my Prometheus board. A lot of times we're going over vocabulary, discussing, what is this word in English? What is it in Spanish? Or sometimes the kids don't even know what the word is in their native language. So pointing out what the word is in the native language, if you know it, and then pointing out what the equivalent is in English. And of course, emphasizing cognates, especially when they start spelling, specifically showing what are the different cognates and how they're spelled differently. What are the differences in spelling? You can lay out the patterns between, experimento and experiment. What's the difference? Pretty much the words are the same, except we have a vowel in the end in Spanish. And so showing those patterns so that they begin to understand that there is a rhyme and reason to how words are spelled in one language versus the other.
I'll jump in here. I think being very intentional in your teaching is important because time is such an issue. Everything you do needs to be intentional. And when capitalizing on what kids already know is important. And what Sonia said, it's easier to teach a whole class all at once. So what if everyone came with different skills? And so finding time during the day to differentiate is really important. But also the delivery of your instruction is important too. So direct, explicit, systematic instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency, and all of that is to get kids to lift those words off the page. And then you also have to have very intentional instruction in the language comprehension side of the rope. And once kids can map that sound to its spelling and then read a word, they then have to make meaning of that word. And then they put it all together into a sentence and into a paragraph and into a whole text. And so you start with the letter sound associations and then move into reading decodable text. And then they can, every word becomes a sight word at a certain point. But a lot of times when I'm out in classrooms, what I see is people kind of winging it, and it's not an intentional. You can tell perhaps maybe it hasn't been intentionally planned so that I know what my objective is. I know what I want kids to get out of this text, and I've planned my questioning to help them make that deeper meaning from what they're reading. And it takes time, and you have to know your standards, and you have to know your ELD standards, and you have to set up your designated and integrated ELD to put kids where they need to be so that they're successful with your lesson. And I wish we could give everybody all the time in the world to plan out every single thing that they need to do so thoroughly. But once you experience that, I think it becomes easier, and it really is a more efficient way to go about your instruction.
I think I saw your hand. Oh yeah, I thought I saw Ka's hand. Yep.
I think a lot of times we just figure that when we throw teachers in the classroom, that we assume that they know how to teach reading. And we assume that, they're going to be grouping kids according to reading levels and proficiency levels. But what I'm seeing is a lot of new teachers really do need to be taught how to teach reading. And I think that's the missing component. I'm just talking about my site. Oftentimes, I go in and the teacher's just teaching the curriculum and so forth. But, because they don't know the foundation to reading and how to teach reading, of course, they're going to follow just the curriculum. So we are very lucky that at our site, we do have our, before we used to have coaches that go in to help the teachers how to recognize deficiencies and how to break kids into smaller groups. But I think the teachers are doing a great job. I think we just need to really focus on teaching our teachers how to teach reading to our kids.
I did want to jump in. We're getting some questions from the audience and also some that came before. Question about best practices. We've been talking a lot about reading, obviously. What best practices do you have for STEM teachers to effectively support the needs of emergent bilingual students? And I know, Pedro, you were mentioning some of the things you do. So wondering, just opening up to the group, what could STEM teachers do to support?
Well, I was a STEM resource teacher for a few years, and one of the things that's really nice about STEM is that there's a lot of cognates, and you can use those when you're teaching, different parts of the sciences. So if you can do a STEM activity and use some of those cognates to be able to explain concepts, especially, we can get kids showing up in 8th grade who have never spoken English before, and they're in the middle of a science lesson and they're lost. But if you can find some cognates to help them comprehend, and maybe have somebody who speaks their language sitting next to them to be able to explain some of the information that's being expressed in the class, and also using lots of visuals. My kids love it when I use my Prometheus board to explain to them. Like I say, we're studying the letter F, and I say flamenco, and they don't even know what flamenco is in Spanish, right? So I show it to them, and I explain it to them in Spanish, and then I give them the word in English. So there's a lot of cognates there in the sciences that you can use to be able to support learning, especially if they're newcomers.
I think the other thing that the question raises is a really important one, which is the integration really of the content with literacy instruction. We don't see this as different. We see this as one of the difficulties of fitting everything in a day is when you do everything discretely, as opposed to figuring out how these mesh together. So it's really important, actually, to still engage students in the learning of the content, to figure out how to scaffold then their engagement in that when they're English learners with appropriate scaffolds. But by the same token, and this goes with respect to decodable texts too, you don't want to overdo scaffolding because you need students to stretch, right? And so you need to provide them with the ability to process in their own language when able to, but to engage in that grade level content as well.
I want to jump into, I'm so glad you said the stretch part, Martha. So often I do see over scaffolding because we think it's helping. That was a great point. Some support that I did in a middle school a few years ago. One of the things that we discovered throughout the departments was take something like argument. Argument shows up in all the content areas, but every department was approaching it differently. We have this acronym in English, and in science, we're using this acronym. And it's from a kid perspective, that makes the day really hard. But if we looked at it from the kid perspective instead, and we got together and said, okay, at our school, this is how we're going to approach argument. And we're going to support the kids by varying it in terms of how the content of it works. But these are the main elements of it. And then everyone has the same language and there's coherence across the site. And that's supportive for every kid.
Yeah, I think it's important to use sentence frames to support that language, that language development. So in the sciences, it may be something like, because I put these two chemicals together, this is what happened. So maybe that first part of the phrase is laid out for them, and you practice it a few times so that they have the language.
One of the things that, we all keep talking about time and how, we know that we need more time. But, you also mentioned right now that using other content from other areas sort of helps you integrate everything that you need. But I've heard from experts, like, we know that all kids, including English learners, need to learn how to decode, need to learn phonics. They need to learn vocabulary, but English learners need more vocabulary and more language development. Everybody needs writing too, but how, then there are concerns that if you do too much of one thing, that you're going to leave out the other thing. And I've heard that from people saying that we need to have more decoding and phonics. And so, we need to have more time for that. And then I've also heard people say, no, we need more time for language, and we need to have all of those things. So how do we make sure, how do we find the time, and how can we fit it all in?
It is so hard. I mean, someone mentioned that we don't have enough hours in the day every training I go to, they recommend 2 hours for language arts and an hour for math. And we don't have that time. What works for me, what's been working is, integrating. So not just, the 30 minutes of ELD, but do ELD the whole day, combining the curriculum, different subjects, projects, again, I like to think of quality, not just, quantity. And, that's what I try to do in the classroom. And then I also document what's working. And so next year I don't do that, and I do something different. So modify for the following year.
I think we need to be in multiple fronts. We need to teach reading, writing, listening, speaking, language development. Those all are important components. In terms of pushing decoding and phonics, I just think you have to know your clientele. You have to know your clientele. So if my clientele was, upper middle class, they have a library at home, the parents can help the kids, and they have rich vocabulary. You know what? Balanced literacy is okay. But for me, my clientele, is, we have a high, we have like 58% students speaking another language. A lot of my parents, they don't really have time to help their kids because they're working to put food on the table. Also, they don't know how to teach their kids. So for our program, we like to really build on the foundational skills. We believe that K2 is learning to read, and 3, 4, 5 is reading to learn the contents. So, like I said, you have to know your clientele. If they need more phonics and decoding, then that's what you have to give the kids. So it's just based on needs. It's not something that, I'm just going to do phonics and decoding more. It's based on, you have to know your clientele. You have to know the needs of the kids and just address that. But for our school, we are in multiple fronts.
I'm gonna jump in. Kai, you're totally right. And I want to say, though, that I just want to be careful with balanced literacy, because there is not an evidence base for that. And a lot of times kids in balanced literacy programs seem to be doing okay because they're in after school tutoring to make up some of those gaps. So, but what I will say about how do we fit it all in, it's really hard. But something that helps is to really get your tier 1 instruction solid. And that will end up actually saving you a lot of time in the end, because if you think about, if you had 80% of your class reading on grade level versus 80% of your class not reading on grade level, what makes a more efficient day in terms of time? Well, the kids who are on grade level. And then you have intervention time for the kids who are not. But if your tier 1 is not solid and you are just continually churning kids into tier 2, it makes for a really tough day. But continuous improvement can help you with that. Professional learning can help you with that. Having somebody come in and help you with your literacy landscape. What does it look like across your campus? To help you bring your tier 1 more in line and make it more effective. I would recommend that. I'll hand off to Martha.
We have another, I'm sorry, Martha, did you have something to add?
Oh, I guess I just wanted to say, I want to encourage us to, again, remember about the plethora of skills that we're talking about. And we're not just talking about decoding and phonological awareness. And we're not talking about these things out of context. And and to then remember the language comprehension side of the equation is very important, and the simultaneous aspect of this. It isn't a first this and it's then this. It really is, how do we create the meaning in order for this decoding to actually map on to the brain in the way that we want it to. So I do want to emphasize that I think that that balanced literacy kind of implies a variety of things. And I don't want that to be interpreted as you don't do language comprehension and that you don't do ELD and meaning making for students then when they, again, don't have the background knowledge in order for the decoding and phonological awareness work that you want to do for that to stick.
Thank you for that. We have a question in the audience acknowledging lots of great examples mentioned here today for dual language immersion classes and bilingual classes where the predominant language is Spanish. What about in those, is there any research that you can point to or any experience about in those classrooms where the primary language is something other than Spanish, or you have multiple languages that are primary languages? And what are the best practices there or research that you can point to?
I don't think
open to anyone.
Yeah, the research isn't like that different. I mean, the difference is it has to do with what are the similarities and differences between the two languages at play. And so then the point I made earlier about there's no need to teach foundational skills that transfer between those two languages. It depends then on the orthography of the languages and how shallow, deep those language orthographies are and how much they compare to then English. So I am not an expert, definitely, in Asian languages, but it is my understanding, at least character-based Asian languages, that there is a lot more than meaning-making and morphological awareness. I should say not meaning-making, but morphological awareness that's involved in that, in the teaching then of that. But it doesn't then deny the fact that we have this English orthography that students still need to crack that code. And so, I'm out of my depth, definitely, in talking about other languages, but I do want to just kind of emphasize the general aspects of know what the similarities and differences are between those languages, that the languages, you leverage them to support one another, and you point out similarities and differences, and where you really hone in on and are explicit about is then the teaching of these irregularities within and across the two languages.
Go ahead, Becky.
Yeah, I just wanted to say nobody's born hardwired to read, and we go speech to print. So from a very young age, we're developing oral language, and oral language is different from written language. And once they enter school, no matter what the target language is, then we continue to foster that oral language. And then we learn sounds, and then we attach those sounds to something that's written down. And then we put them all together, and that kind of works the same no matter what language. And it all has to be taught because most kids will learn to speak naturally, but nobody just is wired to read.
So I interviewed, Tim Shanahan, who led the National Literacy Panel on second language learners. And one of the things that really stood out to me was he said, that there are little tweaks, little changes that you can make to a lesson that can make a really big difference for English learners. And, the example he gave was like when you're learning to do reading comprehension, teachers often, the whole group reads a text. Then you ask the students to discuss, talk about it, respond. What did you learn from this text? What questions do you have? And he said sometimes with English language learners, they may just be quiet after no one is responding. And that a little change, letting them talk in small groups in either English or in their home language, and then discuss with the bigger group just makes a huge difference. And so I'm curious what other little changes people think, can make big differences for English learners.
Well, we often talk about pre-teaching vocabulary. So pre-teaching vocabulary can also mean taking that vocabulary that's going to be key in the text and connecting it to a visual if you can, so that kids, when they get into the text, they can at least have, a ballpark idea of what's going on, and then fleshing it out through discussion. So do some pre-teaching of vocabulary so that kids have something to kind of hook onto when they're at least thinking about it. They're quiet, but they're thinking about what's going on in discussion. They're thinking about what they know from the visuals they've seen. I sometimes, before I even read a text, I'll show a little video on the text so that the kids can see, oh, this is what it means to do whatever. I remember assessing a child that, I don't know if people are still using the ARI, the Analytical Reading Inventory, but I was testing the kid, and the kid could give me all the right answers. Yes, the story is about a colt. Yes, the colt was escorted by the owner. Yes, the colt got injured, so they had to take him to the vet. And then at the end, I asked, "What's a colt?" The kid went because they thought it was some kind of cow. If I had just shown them a colt at the beginning of the story, their comprehension would have been much greater, right? But it was an assessment, so I couldn't do that. So, but just as an example, he was trying to figure out what was going on in the story based on a cow, and just knowing what a colt was. And how often do we use the word colt in our everyday language?
I agree with Pedro. We were taught to review. They didn't get it. Let's review, but we forget to preview. Something I like to do is I go around and I choose someone and I tell that person, that student, I'm going to ask you this. So be ready. And they just feel so, all this knowledge that they have and they love to share. And they're ready to share, but I tell them ahead of time.
I think the other thing we should, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kyle.
One change that I implemented at our school is reading. Kids have to read every day. Our school has a goal of 50,000 books, and that averages to 116 books per child per school year. I was a reading recovery teacher. I was a reading coach. And what I found out was that kids don't have enough time to practice reading. So when you do something like a sports or anything, you have to practice. So that really helped accelerate reading for our kids, because guess what? They're going to be, because of the requirement, they're going to be exposed to literary genres. And we have a program called Accelerated Reader. So the kids read a book and then they go test, and it tests their comprehension too. So, like I said, I was looking up, and they said that kids that love reading books read an average of 44 books per year, and kids that are not so into books read an average of 22 books per year. So by giving my students a reading practice, and that they have to meet their reading goal every month, I think it really helps with the reading practice. And overall, the kids are doing a good job. They meet their reading goals, and they accelerate in terms of moving up to a higher level of reading.
I'm so glad Kyle went first, because that's exactly the points I was going to make, which is let's not forget about joy in learning. And part of that is really letting students choose what to read periodically, and just encouraging reading. I mean, celebrating reading. I was listening to a panel where Dr. Julie Washington from UCI was talking about a really effective intervention they had for the students they were working with, many of whom were African American. And she said, we just realized we just needed to give them books too. It was that we need to just provide the opportunity for students to read, and then allow them choice and to just encourage it.
I totally agree that we need joy, but I also know that many students really struggle to read, and then it's not a joyful time. And I'm curious what experiences you've had teaching English learner students who are struggling to read, and what have you found that helps them get over that?
I mean, due to the pandemic, I heard that students are behind 6 to 7 months. Something I like to do is find their interests. What do they like? I have students that, like dinosaurs. This year I have a class that loves soccer. And so for writing, they write all about Messi. They write all about Cristiano Ronaldo. So I incorporate, first I do a survey, what do they like? And then I teach, depending on their interest. Books at their level. I teach them when I go to the library, they love to check out Harry Potter books, and that's not their level. And so I teach them also, this is the book that's, appropriate for you. And, I think that's also, important. I also like to get parents on board. So I don't just meet with them during parent teacher conferences. I'm always sending, messages, and, we're a team. And so if a child is struggling, they need to know. No surprises during conferences, but they need to know. And I send resources also so they can support at home.
One of the things that I find my kids really love, here they are, they're kinders. What do? They go for the graphic novels, and they really, really are into looking through the graphic novels. And even though they may not be able to decode it, what are they doing? They're following the storyline, and they're actually reading and making up the storyline as they go. So there's a host of ways that you can create access. At the upper grades, they also have graphic novels that kids can read, and also they have novels that are simplified, right? But kind of piggybacking on what Sonia said, telling parents that reading in the native language is super important. It's just, you can't overemphasize the amount of thinking that goes on, the metacognition, understanding storyline, understanding genre, vocabulary development. I mean, one of the problems that happens with our kiddos is even if they're beautiful readers, then they get to the upper grades and they don't have the language and the vocabulary. So they can decode fine, but it's more word call because they don't have the vocabulary. So that's super important to have parents reading and talking with their kids at home.
I wanted to jump in. I wanted to address the previous question about the small changes, and then this one also. I was thinking about some of the things you were saying, and sometimes it's about the scheduling. When are you doing ELD, for instance? And you can really capitalize on that by taking some of the key components of a lesson that you will be doing later in the day or tomorrow and addressing those during your English language development time, your designated time of day, so that kids have rehearsal with it instead of reviewing it after. If you're in a reviewing situation, then they've gone through the lesson, perhaps not understanding the key elements that you're after. But if you preview it ahead of time and give rehearsal, then they can fully, hopefully, participate in the main part of the lesson. So again, it comes down to that planning piece. And then the other thing that I wanted to address, which I just forgot what it was. I'm sorry, Sadie.
It's part about challenging.
Thank you.
To have a challenge.
Yes. Oh my gosh, full brain. So what exactly are they struggling with? So you have to have good assessment, because you don't want to spend time targeting skills that are not the skills in need. So you need to have really a comprehensive assessment system, and then you have a more targeted intervention time, so that you can be giving kids grade level content, but also shoring up the skills that are in need. That's really important.
I do want to jump in as we kind of near the hour with another question from the audience. In fact, two different questions, but you were just talking about assessments, Becky. There was a question earlier about what are some of the best assessments or assessment tools. So thoughts on that. And then the second question, we obviously have been talking a lot about early learners and younger students. So what about those students who are learning English, but maybe they are in middle school or high school? Any suggestions, best practices that you know of, or is it just translatable? How can you approach that? So two very different questions. Tackle them as you wish.
I can answer the older student situation problem. That's my case. That was my story. I learned English in high school. And so I used to cry every day. I didn't understand what my teachers were saying. I learned English by listening. I didn't learn the proper way, the phonics, the grammar, all that. So it's really important for those older students to have a support person. I had someone always, in class that would help me translate all the visuals, the artifacts, the things that were already mentioned. The use of technology. I mean, technology is so advanced nowadays. There's so many educational programs that adapt to that, every child's need. So I think that's important for those older students. Making sure that they have the growth mindset. Things are hard, but we can do this and we can try it. And that mistakes are proof that they're learning.
I like to talk a little bit about that. My parents came to America as refugees and so forth. I remember going to school was so difficult. I tried so hard to read and write and listen and learn. I remember in 5th grade, I really liked the book, The Secret Garden, and I couldn't read any of it. So I would go check the book out, like every week we go to the library, I would renew that book and renew that book and renew that book, but I couldn't read any of it. So, I didn't really learn English until I was in high school, or understand English until I was in high school. And it's just basically, my teachers were great. They created visuals for me. They gave me lots and lots of practice, and I practiced, English with my friends that don't speak English either. So, we just kind of try to help each other out. But I think for my experience, it's just listening, practicing, just working hard every day to try to be part of the mainstream students, and it was very difficult. So with that being said, like I said, I don't know when I really did learn how to read, but it's all said in high school. I was like, oh, okay, I'm beginning to be able to read the prints and so forth, and I was able to understand English a lot better. But like I said, when I graduated high school, it was still a struggle until I went to college, and I don't know, all of a sudden my brain just kind of bloomed through all the being exposed to the language around me. So for all middle school and high school kids, don't give up. Keep on going.
I just want to, I guess, chime into that is, I think your experiences also just point to the importance of oral language, right? Practice, the hearing, the receptive, the expressive, how critical that is. But that's not, again, to deny. I don't know if you had literacy in your first language that you were able to transfer or not, but that oral language kind of immersion is important, but it's not enough, right? And we know that also from the EL world, and that for students, that's why the whole Lau decision came down, was, that you have to provide explicit instruction in English language development too. So some students may naturally pick it up, but others will definitely need explicit instruction. And then the last thing I'll say is about the assessment piece, because I think we're always looking for the holy grail in assessments, and it doesn't exist. It really depends upon maybe we'll get there, because we're getting really good, right, about assessments and about the interactive nature of learning and using technology in really sophisticated ways, but we're not there yet. And so it's really important then for teachers to have the knowledge of how to use which is so important, formative assessment in classrooms about discrete skills. So as Becky alluded to earlier, when the question was asked about students who have challenge, what is the challenge? So you need to know what the challenge is. If it is a coding issue, then it doesn't matter how much meaning making that you do around that. The student hasn't figured out the code. But if it's not the coding issue and there is meaning making that's lacking there, you need to attend to the meaning making. You need to attend to the language piece. You have to get real deep there. So really, we need to do more to help teachers both do more formative assessment and know how to interpret assessments when it comes to English students who are learning English as a second language.
Does anyone else want to jump in, or we can move on to kind of as we wrap up? I'm thinking, California there's a big effort in California to try to aim to improve how reading instruction is taught, because so many kids are not reading at grade level by third grade. How do we kind of come together and move forward and make sure that the needs of English learners are not overlooked, and at the same time that we can actually move forward and improve reading instruction for everyone?
I think we need to, Pedro, we need to continue with professional development for teachers. We need to encourage teachers to attend. We need to keep asking for good curriculum. A lot of the curriculum we use, in dual language programs, they're poorly translated. And so we need to ask for good assessments. We need to look for good assessments. I think teachers need to continue to advocate for students.
I was going to say that in terms of learning to read, we really do need curriculum that's very, very structured. We can't continue to adopt curriculum that has phonics kind of as a side note. Oh, we'll teach F, and then for some reason we're teaching M, but there's no connection, and there's no scope and sequence. And especially for new teachers, they come in and they're given a curriculum that is very haphazard, and then they wonder, well, what am I supposed to do? And hopefully they have an experienced grade level teacher at their grade level who could say, this is how I organize my curriculum. A lot of districts do have structured sequential instructional scope and sequence, but some districts do not, and leaving it up to one person, that's a big ask. So I would say that at the district level, at the site level, coming up with very structured phonemic awareness activities and phonics. We at our site adopted specific phonemic awareness instruction. And that helped me a lot, because honestly, it takes a lot of work to be able to provide a very structured program on your own. We as teachers really don't have time to write too much curriculum.
Sorry to interrupt you, Pedro, and yes to everything you said. Martha and I were involved in a project with Pivot Learning called Finding Common Ground, and that might be a great place for people to start to see what are some agreements that are out there around instruction, language arts instruction for English learners. And it was a really great experience, and you'll find information about foundational skills and assessment and many other things. And we were also both involved in the Reading League Summit in Las Vegas just a couple of months ago, where there were panels of experts who were discussing many of the things that we're discussing today. And to let you know, too, there's some follow-up work going on that she and I are both involved in as well, where it's kind of putting to rest some urban legends, kind of a white paper, if you will. And so look for that. Hopefully it'll be coming out soon. But things like, Science of Reading is not a curriculum. It is a vast interdisciplinary body of research and things like that. So look for that coming soon. If we can all agree on things. Just kidding.
You want to have the last word?
Not really. I just feel like, teachers need professional development in teaching reading. We can't just be throwing teachers in there and expect them to just teach reading. I mean, they don't know how, and they need guidance and help. So I think investment in PD, how teachers can teach reading, that's going to make a huge difference.
Completely agree, and it has to be with ELs. If they're teaching ELs, it has to be on the EL research and really understanding second language acquisition in a bilingual context or an English only one.
Well, we are at the hour. I know, as in many of our roundtables, we can continue this conversation probably for another hour easily. But I want to take a chance to thank every single one of our panelists, including those who are working behind the scenes, answering a lot of the questions. We had a lot of great questions asked by the audience. Thank you to that. Thank you to the audience for that. Thank you to Sobrato Philanthropies for the support that allows us to have these monthly roundtables.